What's going on, everyone? This is Kevin here, coming at you with my comparison of the Samsung Galaxy A16 5G versus the Samsung Galaxy A15 5G. Let's get started. So this is the Samsung Galaxy A16 5G, and this is the Galaxy A15 5G. As the name of the A16 5G implies, this phone is the successor to last year's A15, and the A16 very recently launched in October of this year, and we actually got the A15 5G in January of 2024, so it is pretty interesting that they're not even waiting an entire year to go from one generation to another. Now, if you've been following my channel for a bit, you know that I cover everything related to the A series, and what's new this year is that I'm actually doing bonus content on my Instagram and TikTok, so definitely make sure to check that out. But in many ways, going from the A15 to the A16 5G is really more of an evolution rather than a complete redesign. But honestly, that's not necessarily a bad thing because we already had a really good phone here with the A15 5G, and they're really just making things better. However, there is one major omission this time around with the A16, and that is that there is no 3.5mm headphone jack, whereas there is a headphone jack here with the A15. Now, I know for many people that might be a deal breaker, especially considering that for a long time, it was the budget phones like these that were the only ones that even offered a headphone jack. But it's looking like this time around with this year of the A series from Samsung, they are now not even giving us a headphone jack at all. So it is what it is. It is something that really doesn't surprise me. I saw this coming because for a long time, almost about maybe nearly a decade now, flagship phones haven't had headphone jacks. So it was really inevitable that eventually the budget phones also wouldn't include that feature. But beyond that one shortcoming, pretty much everything else about the A16 5G is better than its predecessor. For example, this time around with the display, it is slightly larger at 6.7 inches compared to 6.5 inches with the A15 5G. Now both displays are Super AMOLED, which is definitely a really great thing. They are both 90 Hz. However, it's a very smooth 90 Hz. In many ways, it almost feels more like 120, but it is technically 90. But the biggest difference here that you probably noticed are the bezels. So with the A15 5G, this phone of course does have a smaller display, but these two phones are about the same size. And the reason why that's even possible that the display is bigger here with the A16 is because of how much smaller these bezels really are. You can see side by side here, without a doubt, the side bezels on the A16 5G are way smaller. The bottom bezel on the A16 is still pretty big, which is disappointing. And then you can see up top, both phones do have water drop notches, and in some ways, the notch is actually bigger here on the A16 5G compared to the predecessor. But overall, I definitely prefer the design of the A16, and both phones do feature 1080p displays. We're getting almost the same PPI here at 385 with the A16 compared to 396 with the A15. And then both phones do feature 19.5:9 aspect ratios, so a more narrow but taller form factor. And then with the A16 5G, we are getting an 86% screen-to-body ratio compared to 84.3% with the A15 5G. So again, a pretty big difference there when it comes to bezel size. Now for the front-facing cameras on both devices, they are both 13 megapixels, and then both phones do feature 128 gigabytes of internal storage, and thankfully both phones do have microSD card expansion. So I'm glad SD card expansion is still a feature here with the A16 5G, as I know a lot of people specifically want to buy phones that have that feature because there really aren't too many phones left that actually have it. Now there's no wireless charging with either of these two phones, which is a bit unfortunate, but both phones do feature face unlock, and they both have fingerprint sensors on the power buttons. You can see it's almost an identical configuration here, but we'll give it a try first here with the A16 5G, and we can see very fast there and responsive. We'll try it now with the A15. And there we go. A little bit slower maybe, but let me try that again. Yeah, it's about the same, but that's definitely a nice feature to have. I do wish that it was built into the display instead of being on the power button here, but at the same time, it's not necessarily that big of a deal that it is on the power button. Now, both of these phones do have triple camera setups in the back. You can see the camera setup is almost identical here with 3 cameras and then 1 flash. So we're getting a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide angle camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera for close-up images. And then both phones do support portrait mode, which of course is a great feature. But here's how things look on the camera apps on both devices. Then from here we can go over to 0.5 to access the ultra wide angle cameras. And you can see by making that switch, we can fit a lot more content into a single frame here. Then you can go over to the More tab, and then from there, you can access the macro camera, And then with macro, you can get very close up and have things be in really good detail here. So definitely nice that even though these are meant to be lower end phones, we're still getting a lot of different camera features. Now flipping around here to take a selfie, there's me right there. We also have an option for group selfies, which is nice. And then of course you can take portrait selfies as well. Now with both of these phones, video recording does max out at 1080p, so I wish it was 4K at least on the A16, but unfortunately it's not. Now both phones do have 5,000 milliamp hour internal batteries, and they're also both compatible with up to 25 watt fast charging. So that's definitely a nice fast charging speed, and honestly there's some flagship phones that are just now getting 25 watt fast charging, so the fact that we're getting that here with these budget phones really makes things even more impressive. And then also, it does depend on the region, but both phones do have NFC, so you can use them for tap and pay using a service such as Samsung Pay. Now, what's interesting too about the software is that both of these phones are shipping out of the box with Android 14 and Samsung's One UI 6. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, the A15 5G wasn't even launched a year ago. This phone was launched in January of 2024. So it's basically 9 months in between these two devices, which is a pretty short period of time. But because of that, we are getting the same version of Android out of the box. Now, both of these phones are supposed to be getting Android 15 with Samsung's One UI 7, but that probably won't be out until January or February of next year. Now, as far as RAM and processors go with these two devices, this can be different based on the region. I know that, for example, in the US, the A15 5G comes with 4 gigabytes of RAM. However, this version is the global version with 6. And then it's the same thing here with the A16 5G. This is the global model of the phone, and this phone does have 6 gigabytes of RAM. And then the processors are different based on the region as well. For the A16 5G, this phone comes with either the Exynos 1330 or the MediaTek Dimensity 6300. This is the Exynos version of the phone. And then with the A15 5G, you can get this phone with the MediaTek Dimensity 6100 Plus. And I've definitely noticed some major performance gains going with the A16 5G compared to the A15. Now, I did run a benchmark test using Geekbench 6, and here are the scores from that test. So you can see here with the A16 5G, I got a single core score of 977 compared to 699 with the A15 5G. And then the multi-core score is also slightly higher here with the A16. So without a doubt, the A16 is the faster phone of the two, so certainly keep that in mind. Now, taking a look at the overall hardware of these two phones, they're very similar. These devices are made completely of plastic, besides the displays, which are made of glass, of course. And then on the right side of both phones, we have the volume buttons, and then also the power button, which doubles as the fingerprint sensor. Then on the left side of both phones, we have just the slot for the microSD card and SIM card. Then up top here, we have the noise-canceling microphone. On the bottom here, both phones have the microphone, USB-C port for charging and data transfer, and the speaker. But again, with the A16 5G, there is no 3.5mm headphone jack. So that's really the biggest difference here with the actual hardware. And then on the back of the two phones, it's an identical setup here. However, we are getting a glossy finish with the A16 5G, whereas the A15 5G is a matte gradient finish here. So I'm really curious to know which of these two phones you prefer. I mean, like I said, other than the headphone jack disappearing here, the A16 5G is better in every way compared to the A15 5G. But it really comes down to pricing and availability. So, for example, if you can buy the A15 5G for a lot less than the A16, then it might be worth going for this device just because of how similar they actually are. But at the same time, the A16 5G is a lot faster, so even that in itself does present a lot of value here. But like I mentioned, I hope you enjoyed this video, but check me out on Instagram and TikTok. I've been doing a lot of bonus content on those platforms, so I definitely would appreciate the support over there. But this is Kevin here. This is the Samsung Galaxy A16 5G versus the Samsung Galaxy A15 5G. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one. Take care and have a great rest of your day.